Train your mind to respond, not react. A man received a phone call telling him his entire family had been killed in an accident, and 48 hours later, he was back in the operating room, performing surgery on a stranger's heart, hands perfectly steady. This is a true story, and we will return to it in full later in this script, because it sits at the absolute outer edge of what we are about to explore. Most people hear that and assume the man felt nothing. He felt everything. What he had, 3 years of deliberate, unglamorous training most people never bother to undertake, was the ability to feel the full weight of something and still choose, consciously, what his hands and his voice and his next decision would actually do with that feeling. That gap, between what hits you and what you do next, is the entire subject of what follows. There is a reaction, and there is a response, and almost no one is taught the difference, even though the difference determines nearly everything about the quality of a man's life. A reaction is automatic, immediate, governed entirely by whatever chemical and emotional process your body launches the instant something happens to you. A response is chosen. It happens in the same circumstances, sometimes within the same fraction of a second, but it passes first through a filter that a reaction skips entirely, the filter of a trained, deliberate mind that has decided, in advance, what kind of man it intends to be regardless of what just occurred. Viktor Frankl, who survived conditions designed specifically to strip every shred of choice from a human being, wrote the sentence that this entire channel and this entire script are built around. Between stimulus and response there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. He did not discover this in comfort. He discovered it while everything else had already been taken from him, which is exactly why it carries the weight it does. This is inner steel. And today, across 8 disciplines, each one carried by a person who was tested in conditions most of us will hopefully never face, we are going to train that exact space, the space between what happens to you and what you do about it, until it becomes wide enough to actually live in, instead of something you fall through every single time life pushes you. If building that space in your own mind matters to you, subscribe to Inner Steel now, because this is the entire purpose of what we do here. Let's begin. Point 1. A reaction is borrowed from whoever provoked you. Admiral James Stockdale was shot down over Vietnam in 1965 and spent the next 7.5 years as a prisoner of war, much of it in conditions of repeated torture, isolation, and deliberate psychological pressure designed by his captors to break him completely, to extract a reaction, a confession, a collapse they could use for propaganda purposes against the country he served. What Stockdale later described, in interviews and writing after his release, was a specific, deliberate discipline he built and refined across those years. The recognition that every single time he reacted purely on instinct to what was being done to him, out of fear, out of pain, out of the desperate desire for the torture to simply stop, he was handing his captors something they wanted and he was not. They wanted his reaction. His reaction was the entire point of the exercise from their side. The moment he reacted instead of responded, he had given them a measure of control over him that no physical restraint alone could have achieved. So Stockdale trained himself, under conditions that would break most people within hours, to insert something resembling Frankl's space even into torture itself, to feel everything that was happening to his body completely, while still retaining, somewhere underneath the pain, a thread of deliberate choice about how he would carry himself, what he would or would not say, and crucially, what kind of internal posture he would maintain regardless of what his body was being subjected to. He survived to be released in 1973, and went on to articulate what later became known as the Stockdale paradox, the simultaneous holding of brutal, clear-eyed honesty about how bad a situation actually is, alongside an unshakable, disciplined faith that you will ultimately prevail, refusing to let either the honesty or the faith collapse into the other. He noted, pointedly, that the prisoners who did not survive psychologically were often the optimists who insisted everything would be fine quickly and collapsed when it wasn't, not because optimism is wrong, but because reaction-based optimism with no discipline underneath it cannot survive contact with sustained reality. A reaction belongs, in a very real sense, to whoever or whatever provoked it. Your anger when someone insults you is shaped entirely by their insult. They chose the words, the timing, the target, and your reaction simply followed the script they wrote. A response is yours, built in advance, deployed regardless of what script anyone else hands you. Stockdale, in the most extreme circumstances imaginable, proved that even when everything else has been taken, that authorship remains available to anyone willing to train for it. Point 2. The pause is where the choice actually lives. Abraham Lincoln, throughout his presidency, developed a specific and well-documented habit whenever he found himself furious at a general, a cabinet member, or a political rival who had wronged him or undermined the war effort he was desperately trying to hold together. He would sit down and write what historians now refer to as his hot letters, long, unrestrained, often scathing responses laying out exactly what he thought of the offending party, and exactly how he felt about what they had done. And then, in the overwhelming majority of documented cases, he would not send them. He would fold the letter, set it aside, and often simply leave it unsent permanently, filed away among his papers, where many of them were discovered only after his death. The act of writing the letter had served its purpose entirely. It had given the emotion somewhere to go, had let him feel the full force of his own fury on paper, without ever requiring him to unleash that fury onto another person who would then have to react to it in turn, very possibly escalating a conflict the Union could not afford during a civil war already straining to hold together. One of the most famous of these unsent letters was addressed to General George Meade after the Battle of Gettysburg, where Lincoln believed Meade had failed to pursue and destroy Lee's retreating army when he had the chance, potentially extending the war by years through that single failure to act decisively. Lincoln's draft is scathing, precise, and completely justified by the military situation as he understood it. He never sent it. Meade continued serving. The relationship, imperfect as it was, survived intact, and Lincoln's actual response, measured, professional, focused on what could still be salvaged rather than on what had already gone wrong, was the one history actually received. This is the pause given physical form, a deliberate, built-in delay between the first surge of feeling and the final, sent communication. Lincoln did not suppress his anger or pretend it wasn't there. He wrote pages of it, in detail, with real heat. He simply refused to let the unfiltered first draft of his fury become the actual response the world received, understanding instinctively what neuroscience would only later confirm, that the first version of any strong emotional reaction is rarely the most accurate or useful one, and that a brief delay, deliberately inserted, changes almost everything about what eventually gets said. If you've ever wished you could take back the first thing you said in anger, that habit of Lincoln's is worth building into your own life starting today. And if Inner Steel is helping you see exactly how, subscribe, because we're only 2 points into 8. Point 3. What you rehearse in advance is what you will do under pressure. Captain Chesley, Sullenberger was piloting U.S. Airways Flight 1549 in January 2009 when both engines failed simultaneously after striking a flock of birds shortly after takeoff from LaGuardia Airport, leaving him with no functioning propulsion, 155 people on board, and only minutes, by most analyses, under 4, to make a decision that would determine whether everyone aboard lived or died. What happened in the cockpit during those minutes, recovered later from flight data and cockpit voice recordings and extensively analyzed afterward, was not panic. It was a remarkably calm, methodical sequence of decision-making, assessing the failure, running through the relevant procedures, communicating clearly and without alarm to air traffic control, and ultimately concluding that a water landing on the Hudson River was the only realistic option, given the plane's altitude and the impossibility of reaching any nearby runway in the time available. He executed that landing with a precision that left the aircraft largely intact and every single person aboard alive. What made this possible was not raw talent or unusual courage in the moment, though both existed. It was decades of accumulated training, much of it specifically built around scenarios designed to feel exactly like the worst possible moment, simulators recreating engine failures, gliding approaches, emergency checklists rehearsed so many times across a career that they had become close to automatic. Freeing up Sullenberger's conscious attention in the actual emergency to focus on judgment and decision-making rather than on simply remembering what to do first. He later said, in interviews after the event, something that captures this point precisely, that for years he had made small, regular deposits in what he called a bank of experience, education, and training, and that on that January afternoon, the balance was sufficient for him to make a very large withdrawal. This is the discipline most people skip entirely when they think about staying calm under pressure. They imagine calm as a personality trait some people simply have and others don't, rather than as the direct, measurable output of specific rehearsal done long before the pressure ever arrives. Sullenberger's mind did not need to invent a calm response to an engine failure in real time, improvised from nothing. It had already rehearsed something close to that exact response hundreds of times in a simulator, under conditions designed to feel as real as possible, until the actual emergency simply triggered a pattern that had already been built rather than demanding one be created from scratch under maximum pressure with no time to think. Point 4. Naming the emotion breaks its grip on your next move. Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in South African prisons, much of it on Robben Island doing forced labor in a limestone quarry that damaged his eyesight permanently from the constant glare, separated for years from his family with severely restricted visits and correspondence, denied even the right to attend his own mother's funeral. In writing and interviews after his release, Mandela described a specific internal practice he developed and refined across those decades, one that aligns closely with what modern psychology now calls affect labeling, the practice of consciously naming an emotion as it arises rather than simply being swept along by it unexamined. He described moments of overwhelming rage at specific guards, specific humiliations, specific losses that arrived while he was powerless to do anything about them from inside a cell, and described forcing himself, in those moments, to identify precisely what he was feeling and why, rather than letting the feeling simply convert itself automatically into whatever action it was pushing him toward in that instant. He later explained this practice directly, that he made a conscious decision early in his imprisonment to treat his anger as information rather than as instruction. The anger told him something true and important, that an injustice had occurred, that something genuinely worth fighting deserved his continued resistance. But the anger itself, unexamined and unnamed, would have pushed him toward responses that could have gotten him or others killed, or that would have consumed the clarity he needed to actually think strategically about a struggle that was going to take decades rather than days. This act of naming, "I am furious right now, and here specifically is why," created exactly the space Frankl described, inserted between the emotional surge and whatever action might otherwise have followed it automatically and without examination. Mandela emerged from 27 years of imprisonment and chose reconciliation over revenge, in a decision that surprised and at times frustrated even his closest allies, precisely because decades of practicing this kind of naming had given him a relationship with his own anger that allowed him to use its information without being governed by its first impulse. The mechanism here is simple enough that anyone can practice it starting today. Before reacting to anything, silently and specifically name what you are feeling. Not, "I'm fine," or "I'm just annoyed," but the actual, precise emotion, fear, humiliation, betrayal, grief, named clearly to yourself. The naming itself, done honestly, creates a small but real distance between you and the feeling, and that distance is frequently enough space for a chosen response to occupy instead of an automatic reaction. If learning to name what you feel before it decides what you do is something you want to actually build, that's exactly what Inner Steel is here for. Subscribe if you're with us. Point 5. The body you've trained responds where the untrained body only reacts. Simone Biles, during the 2020 Tokyo Olympics, withdrew from several events after experiencing what gymnasts call the twisties, a dangerous, disorienting loss of spatial awareness midair that can turn a routine landing into a serious, potentially career-ending or life-threatening injury. The decision drew enormous public scrutiny in the moment, much of it harsh, from people who interpreted withdrawal as a failure of mental toughness rather than what it actually was. What it actually was, by her own account afterward, was a different and arguably far more advanced form of the exact discipline this entire script is about. Biles had spent years training her body to execute extraordinarily complex, dangerous skills almost automatically, through a level of repetition that had built deep, reliable neural and muscular patterns capable of operating under intense pressure without requiring conscious thought for every individual movement. That training is precisely what allowed her to recognize, in real time and with total clarity, the moment those patterns had become unreliable. When the twisties hit and her body's trained signals stopped matching her conscious spatial awareness, creating a mismatch that, for a gymnast performing skills involving multiple aerial rotations, could end in serious spinal injury if she simply trusted the automatic pattern despite knowing it had become compromised. A less trained athlete, or one less attuned to the difference between trained response and pure reaction, might have simply pushed forward on autopilot, trusting muscle memory that had served them in every previous competition, and risked exactly the kind of injury that ends careers and sometimes far worse. Biles instead made what was, by any objective analysis of the actual physical risk involved, the response of a remarkably disciplined mind, recognizing that her body's normal trained output had become misaligned with reality, and choosing, consciously, to stop rather than continue on a pattern that had stopped being trustworthy in that specific moment. She later described this publicly in terms directly relevant to everything in this script, that the years of training had not been about eliminating fear or risk from her sport, but about building enough self-awareness and enough trust in her own judgment that she could recognize, in real time, exactly when her trained automatic responses needed to be overridden by a deliberate, conscious decision instead. That override, choosing to stop a process her body desperately wanted to continue on momentum alone, is itself an advanced form of responding rather than reacting, applied to a context where the stakes were measured in actual physical danger rather than merely emotional discomfort. Point 6. What you focus on during the storm determines whether you react or respond. Apollo 13's mission to the Moon was aborted in April 1970 after an oxygen tank exploded roughly 200,000 miles from Earth, crippling the spacecraft's main systems and putting the lives of all 3 astronauts aboard in immediate, severe danger. With no possibility of rescue and no realistic alternative except solving the problem with the resources already on the spacecraft and on the ground in Houston. Flight Director Gene Kranz, managing the crisis from Mission Control, became famous afterward for his approach during those tense days, which he summarized in a phrase that has since become something close to a mantra in high-stakes fields well beyond aerospace. Failure is not an option. But the deeper discipline beneath that now famous line was not blind optimism or denial of how dire the situation actually was. Krantz and his team were entirely clear-eyed about how close to total disaster the mission had come. The discipline was a relentless, deliberate focus on the next solvable problem directly in front of them, broken into pieces small enough to actually act on, rather than on the overwhelming, paralyzing scale of the crisis as a whole. Engineers and flight controllers, many of them working without sleep for days, were asked repeatedly to set aside the full weight of what could go wrong, the very real possibility that all 3 astronauts could die in space, watched in real time by the public and by their own families, and instead direct every available unit of attention toward narrower, concrete questions. How to build a working carbon dioxide scrubber out of materials physically present in the spacecraft, using only parts and procedures the crew could replicate with what they had on hand. How to manage rapidly depleting power reserves to keep the crew alive through the return journey. How to calculate a safe re-entry trajectory with damaged systems and reduced instrumentation. This deliberate narrowing of focus onto the next actionable problem rather than the full, overwhelming scope of the danger is precisely what separates a team that responds under crisis from one that reacts and collapses into paralysis or panic. The astronauts themselves, isolated in a damaged spacecraft with limited heat, limited power, and limited certainty about whether any of the proposed fixes would actually work, maintained a similarly narrow, task-focused composure throughout, executing each instruction from Houston methodically rather than spending their extremely limited remaining energy on the fear that would have been entirely justified given their circumstances. All 3 astronauts returned safely. The mission, despite failing in its original purpose of a lunar landing, became one of the most studied examples in history of what a trained, disciplined focus on the next solvable piece of a crisis can accomplish, even when the full picture would be enough to paralyze almost anyone who let themselves look directly at it for too long. Point 7. A response can be built even in grief, if the training was done before the grief arrived. This brings us back to where we began. The surgeon in the opening of this script was a real person. Accounts of similar cases exist throughout medical literature and oral histories within the profession, of physicians who received devastating personal news and, within an extraordinarily short window, returned to performing procedures on which other people's lives directly depended. What made this possible was not an absence of grief, and it was never presented as such by those who experienced it. The grief in these documented cases was total, immediate, and completely real. There was no suppression, no denial, no pretending the loss hadn't occurred. What had been built, instead, across years of medical training specifically, was an extraordinarily disciplined separation between the emotional processing of an event and the execution of a skill that demanded complete, uncompromised presence regardless of what else was happening internally at the same time. Surgeons train for this directly and explicitly, learning to compartmentalize personal distress during a procedure not because the distress doesn't matter, but because a patient on the table has an absolute right to a surgeon's full, undivided capability regardless of what that surgeon is also carrying that day. This is, in many ways, the most demanding application of everything covered so far in this script, because grief is not a provocation like an insult that a person can decide not to engage with. It is a total, often overwhelming flood that does not ask permission before arriving and does not respect a person's schedule or responsibilities. And yet the same underlying mechanism applies even here. The trained mind can feel the full weight of grief completely, and still execute, in the specific window where execution is required, a response built from years of accumulated discipline rather than a reaction built from nothing in the immediate moment. This does not mean grief should be set aside permanently, or that the discipline described here is a recommendation to avoid processing loss. Quite the opposite. It means that for the specific, bounded windows where a response is genuinely required regardless of internal state, years of prior training make it possible to deliver that response, and then, afterward, in the appropriate time and space, to return fully to the grief and feel everything that needs to be felt without that processing being rushed or denied. The space between stimulus and response that Frankl described does not eliminate the stimulus's power, it simply ensures the response is chosen, deliberately, rather than dictated entirely by whatever the stimulus happens to be in that exact moment. Point 8. The space you build today is the space you will have tomorrow, when it matters most. Marcus Aurelius, throughout the Meditations, returns again and again to a single underlying practice beneath every individual piece of advice he gives himself: the deliberate, daily rehearsal of difficult scenarios before they occur, so that when they eventually do occur, and for an emperor managing plague, war, and betrayal simultaneously, they occurred constantly, his mind already had a built, available space to occupy rather than needing to construct one from nothing under live pressure. He wrote reminders to himself anticipating difficult people before he had even encountered them that day. He rehearsed, in writing, his own mortality, and the mortality of those he loved specifically so that when loss eventually arrived, as it inevitably would and did, it would meet a mind that had already done some of the necessary work in advance rather than one encountering the full shock of the idea for the first time at the worst possible moment. This was not pessimism or morbid preoccupation. It was deliberate architecture, built in calm, intended specifically for use under conditions that would not be calm at all. This is the principle that ties together everything covered across this entire script, from Stockdale in a prison cell to Sullenberger in a falling aircraft to Krantz in mission control to a surgeon walking back into an operating room carrying grief too large to set down. None of them built their capacity to respond rather than react in the moment the crisis actually arrived. By the time the crisis hit, the space was either already there, built across years of prior deliberate practice, or it simply wasn't, and there was no time left to build it from scratch under the worst possible conditions. The space between stimulus and response is not a fixed trait some people are born with and others are permanently denied. It is built, the same way any other capacity is built, through repeated, deliberate practice during the calm, ordinary moments that make up the overwhelming majority of any person's life, so that it is already present, and already wide enough to occupy on the rare, decisive days when everything depends on whether you react or respond. Closing. 8 people. One underlying discipline, trained in 8 different forms of pressure. Stockdale showed us a reaction belongs to whoever provoked it, while a response remains yours even in a prison cell built specifically to take it from you. Lincoln showed us the pause, given physical form on paper, can hold an entire fury without ever needing to unleash it on someone who didn't need to receive it. Sullenberger showed us that the calm response to disaster is not a personality trait, it is a withdrawal from a bank account of training built in small deposits over years. Mandela showed us that naming an emotion precisely, rather than simply being swept along by it, can hold decades of justified rage without letting that rage make the final decision. Biles showed us that even deeply trained automatic responses must sometimes be consciously overridden, and that recognizing the need for that override is itself among the most advanced forms of this entire discipline. Krantz and the Apollo 13 team showed us that